Thanks, Dee. Hi, folks. Nice to see you. This is the first half of a joint presentation of a shared paper by Einav Yogev and me. The paper is called Sublimated Anti-Semitism, Israel in Theory. What follows is a prolegomena to an internal critique of so-called literary and cultural theory as biased in much of its current articulation against Jews and the Jewish state, but not without resources that can help to facilitate its own self-overcoming if we do the intellectual work that's necessary to reclaim the superstructure of the academy at this level. These remarks, therefore, are necessarily programmatic, if not tachlis, and given the time constraints, perforce schematic. Not only is not all criticism of Israel anti-Semitic, but since no one says that it is, it might rather be thought anti-Semitic to insist with Judith Butler that this needs saying at all, let alone all the time. For the lame, ritualized recitation of the self-evident fact that Israel is indeed not the one and only country in the history of the world immunized against ever having to hear a discouraging word presumes that someone somewhere says that it ought to be. And who could that be, after all, but the revolting stereotype of the hypersensitive Jew who by nature cries wolf, or perhaps the supernaturally aggressive Israeli who refuses to listen. All criticism of Israel isn't even anti-Zionist, let alone anti-Semitic, but that shouldn't need to be said. You can call that the Bromsky formulation or the Brahm-Yogev criterion or the Yogev stipulation if you want to take it. With this sort of thing in mind, we, and more of the same sort, we offer neither a pointless left-wing Zionist defense of the anti-Zionist's unthreatened and nowhere in danger right to free speech, nor proceed with a callous right-wing disregard for Palestinian rights from a Jewish triumphalist position. Instead, we speak from what we regard as a Zionist liberal point of view, in which fate decrees that the Zionist comes first and the liberal naturally immediately follows, a position that is, so to speak, in Elchanan Yakir's terms, half Israeli and half American, for those lucky enough to be born Zionist and liberal by choice. In both halves of this felicitous division of labor, please bear in mind, my co-author and I are guided by Ludwig Wittgenstein's maxim, meaning is use. We don't seek the essential Platonic definitions of anything, including anti-Semitism, or where the non-existent line is between hating Jews and hating what half the Jews in the world are inextricably involved with doing just by being Israeli. For there are too many would-be philosophers nowadays ready to reassure us that they are not anti-Semites. You can tell by the way they tell you that they're not. Even or especially as they call for nothing less than Israel's destruction. In case you haven't heard, dispersion or diaspora is the mode in which Jews have in fact survived, writes the prominent postmodern theorist mentioned at the outset, Judith Butler, reassuring her followers that Zionism is not Judaism and anti-Zionism, calling for an end to Jewish sovereignty and self-determination in the land of Israel, is in no way anti-Semitic by definition. Rather, it is Zionists, she fears, who risk courting aggression and so pose a threat to the Jews. It therefore follows that when Ahmadinejad of Iran evokes the end of the state of Israel, he merely expresses a demand that should be more explicitly shared by the democratic countries of the world, as another leading postmodern thinker, Gianni Vattimo, concludes in a volume aptly titled Deconstructing Zionism. Furthermore, I'd like to shoot those Zionist bastards, he adds in a 2014 radio interview. Following out this line of reasoning, the process of ending a Jewish state of Israel would probably precipitate a mass exodus of Jewish Israelis to Europe and the United States, speculates the postmodern theologian Mark Ellis, whose work is cited approvingly in a volume titled The Postmodern Bible. Such notable contemporary theorists as Slavoj Žižek, Luce Irigaray, and others also demand that Zionism be deconstructed, joining those I mentioned and others I haven't got time to name in declaring that contemporary thought at its most daring demands not only the metaphysical critique, but the physical destruction of one UN member state in particular. In the meantime, multiculturalism is a place from which Zionists deserve expulsion. We need to kick Israel out of multiculturalism, writes the well-known Native American Studies specialist Stephen Salida, and not in a tweet, but in his 2011 book, Israel's Dead Soul. With the recent publication in English of an important book by Eric Marty, the French Theory and the Return to the Jewish Question, our postmodernism problem has begun to be addressed. Bruno Schawat's forthcoming study, Is Theory Good for the Jews?, will no doubt advance our understanding further. Kerry Nelson's valuable critique of Butler in the case against academic boycotts of Israel, along with Alan Johnson's incisive early review of her writings on Zionism, are also valuable touchstones. Ahead of everyone else by a decade, Elkanan Yakira set the pace for a serious confrontation with theories of delegitimization in his book, Post-Zionism, Post-Holocaust. More needs to be done. So my co-author, Einav, Yogev, and I set out to do more on the problem of postmodern anti-Semitic anti-Zionism per se, or Israel in theory, under the rubric of what we call sublimated anti-Semitism. This seems an apt phrase, since sublimation refers to what is repressed only to return in a higher, more sophisticated, less crude, more polite, civilized, and socially acceptable form. And theory as a genre, in some ways the dominant paradigm of intellectual production for more than 40 years now, is nothing if not sophisticated. Similarly, Erwin Kotler talks about the laundering of anti-Semitism by the UN and the language of human rights. A number of the speakers at this conference, in fact, have said things that we find congenial and compatible with our notion of anti-Zionism as a displacement of anti-Semitism, or a metonymy for it, a signifier that represents another signifier contingently or by proximity, as in Zionist bankers or raping Greece. Thus, in our view, neither dislike of Jews, anti-Semitism, nor dislike of a Jewish state, anti-Zionism, is properly the origin or source of the other. Neither prejudice is best thought of as the cause or effect of the other, in spite of appearances, but rather the two are more like one and the same chemical compound in different metastable states, in the way that freezing water and melting ice are essentially the same substance under different environmental conditions. Repressed infantile rage and nagging adult guilt are stages in the life of the same libidinal economy. Literal, denotative, and metaphorical connotative dimensions of language are not only inseparable but unthinkable without each other. Clearly, each of these phenomena differs from itself, but yet it would be as clearly a mistake, indeed an illusion, to see only the differences and miss the underlying similarities, indeed continuities. We need to de-reify the critique of protean anti-Semitism in order to keep up with its contemporary manifestations, which are indeed, as several people at this conference have said, nowadays all about Israel. Thus, the concept of sublimated anti-Semitism is offered less as an empirical discovery than a part of an analytical framework for explaining not what anti-Semitism really or essentially is or is not always and everywhere, but why anti-Zionism is here and now, the particular form that anti-Semitism takes under conditions defined by two concrete circumstances: achieved Jewish nationalism on the one hand, coupled with widespread ubiquitous identity politics on the other. Thanks to these overdetermining pressures on what it means to be Jewish, today one can even venture that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are more precisely both discernible as symptoms of Western civilization's underlying drive to express a necessarily hypothetical Judeophobia that, like the death drive in Freud, can never be encountered directly or in its pure unmediated state. Like the death drive in Freud, one discerns and can only ever discern when grafted onto one or another socially acceptable vehicle for more presentable, less unheimlich demands. Judeophobia only ever manifests itself in successive historical embodiments, contingent semiotic constellations, and ever-shifting institutional frameworks. Put another way, as Ben Cohen keenly observed, 1 minute, 10 years ago, but we have yet to fully grasp the meaning, nowadays it is opposition to Jewish self-determination in an age when progressives celebrate the identity politics of marginal, disempowered groups that defines the problem of the new anti-Semitism. And in fact, Lawrence Summers said something very similar just the other day when he talked about hypersensitivity to some and hyper-insensitivity to Jews. With an optic polished to detect sublimated anti-Semitism in practice as well as in theory, this observable inconsistency whereby multiculturalism is sensitive to everyone except for the anti-victim group of the Jews. It appears not just as an inconsistency, in our view, much less an accident or a failure of actually existing multiculturalism to live up to its highest ideals. That would be not a naive, if not hysterical, assumption, we think. And this is the point not to be missed. It is rather a contradiction in the technical sense that Marxists used to like to talk about, a built-in contradiction, a glaring hypocrisy that is functional and indeed fundamental to the operation of the system. The surest sign that what we are dealing with is ideology in the Althusserian sense and discourse in the sense that Michel Foucault defined, about which more from Hénin in a moment. What we clearly see to conclude, above all, from where we now stand, is that, as Daniel Farber and Suzanne Sherry argue, that of the consistent multiculturalist in their 1997 book, Beyond All Reason, the consistent postmodern theorist as well will ultimately be forced to resort to modern versions of ancient anti-Semitic or racist myths. Or as Gianni Vattimo says in an essay titled How to Be an Anti-Zionist Deconstruction, is the possibility of justice and the necessity of diaspora. Yet oddly, this peculiar form of justice is what the anti-Zionist, who is not an anti-Semite, seeks to deny the Palestinians, even as it is meted out necessarily to the ontologically diasporic people, the Jews.